We will now look at the menstrual cycle, keeping in mind the influence that the anterior pituitary gland has on the main organs of the menstrual cycle, the ovaries and the uterus. The menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle, essentially. The highlights of the menstrual cycle include the first 5 days, which is menses or menstrual blood flow, and day 14, which is ovulation. Ovulation is when the ovum, or egg, is released from the ovary. So the menstrual cycle includes several very important hormones from the endocrine system. To begin with, if you remember that in the ovary, the first 14 days is considered the follicular phase, the first 14 days in the uterus is considered the proliferative phase, then the sequence of secretion of the hormones become quite easily. There is also in the second 14 days, for the ovary it is called the luteal phase, and for the uterus it is called the secretory phase. So these parts need to be memorized, then the hormones and the action of the hormones become quite easy. In fact, for the MCAT exam, they could ask you the action of a particular hormone, or they can actually show you the graph of the hormones, point to one of the curves, and ask you which hormone does this represent. So to begin with, the ovary is the follicular phase. So consider what hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland would be the most important hormone in the follicular phase. Clearly, it would be FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. So in terms of the first 14 days of the cycle, the most important hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland would be FSH. So we would expect there to be some sort of curve demonstrating FSH increasing in concentration. So FSH is the most important part. So whenever you see a curve that goes up in the first 14 days but doesn't do anything special in the next 14 days, that must represent FSH. So FSH would go up and then come back down in the first 14 days. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, goes through the blood system, goes to the ovary to stimulate follicles. So it stimulates follicles, which are groups of cells within the ovary. And these follicles start to grow, and then one follicle becomes the number one follicle, or the primordial follicle. This follicle is the one that will be secreting high levels of estrogen. So estrogen starts to be secreted in response to FSH, estrogen coming from the ovary. So now another hormone that we start seeing going in high quantity as a result of FSH is going to be estrogen, which I'll just symbolize as a large E. So estrogen is now coming from the follicle in the ovary. What does estrogen do? Well, estrogen goes throughout the body as a hormone. It is a steroid hormone, and then it goes to the uterus and leads to proliferation. The inner layer of the uterus is called the endometrium. Endo referring to inner, and metrium referring to the smooth muscle of the uterus. So the inner portion of the uterus is called the endometrium. The proliferative phase refers to the fact that estrogen will lead to the proliferation of this inner layer called the endometrium. So it becomes thicker and thicker and thicker in response to estrogen. So now we have the estrogen going up, we have FSH, which rose initially, and then we're coming towards ovulation. Now we know that the next phase will be the luteal phase. So clearly, what would be the most important initial hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland for the luteal phase? It would be luteinizing hormone, or LH. So LH actually comes in just before ovulation as a surge. So when you see a hormone that goes up like that, just peaks all of a sudden just before day 14, that is called the LH surge. So right away, no matter what the other graphs are doing, you know that the one that has the big peak just before ovulation is the LH. And it is felt that ovulation occurs in response to the LH surge or luteinizing hormone coming again from the anterior pituitary gland. So this is clearly a very important hormone which starts the next stage. And then in the next stage, after it does its peak, luteinizing hormone again will start to go up a little bit in the next phase, the luteal phase for the ovary. Now, what is actually occurring? So we had a follicle, it grew. It was producing estrogen, and then at day 14, in response to LH, the follicle releases the egg or ovum. That's ovulation. Now the follicle which remains no longer has the egg. It involutes, turns inwards, and becomes yellow. And coming from the Latin root for a yellow body, we get luteal body. And a body just means, and again, a cluster of cells. So the luteal body is formed in the ovary. And so literally, if you were to dissect and look inside of the ovary, you would see that it's a very yellow cluster of cells. This yellow cluster of cells will now secrete estrogen and progesterone. Again, two steroid hormones coming from the luteal body. Now we know what estrogen does. It maintains the thickness of the endometrium. It makes it thicker and thicker. So that's what estrogen does. So we know that in response to LH, we know that estrogen went up in the first, and again it comes back down, but then it goes back up. So the only hormone that goes up in the first phase, goes back down, then goes back up in the second phase. The only hormone that does that, estrogen. Then we've got progesterone also going up. So progesterone is the hormone which is not up at all in the first phase. Then in the second phase goes up a lot, just like estrogen goes up a lot. So these are the unique features of the movements of these types of hormones. Now, estrogen thickens the lining. Progesterone leads to secretion. So progesterone goes to the lining of the uterus, the inner lining called the endometrium, and helps it secrete fluids. That's very important because the egg has just been released, so there's a possibility that there could be fertilization. And if there's fertilization of the egg, where the sperm and the egg meet, we want implantation in the endometrium. And in order to have implantation, the endometrium must not just be thick, but it also has to have the proper fluids on the endometrium to help the implantation occur. So these fluids are being secreted in response to progesterone. So we have estrogen and progesterone going up. Now, if there is fertilization in this part of the menstrual cycle, then the fertilized egg will start to secrete hormones so that estrogen and progesterone can remain elevated. So that the uterus continues to get thicker and thicker, and there's fluids being secreted and so on. So this will continue in response to a fertilized egg. But if the egg is not fertilized and estrogen and progesterone are high, but there's no fertilized egg, then LH will taper off. We already know FSH is no longer high because it was in the first phase. That was the follicular phase. So FSH is not involved anymore from the anterior pituitary gland. LH drops off because there's no interest in it remaining high. There was no fertilized egg. So in response to the fact that the anterior pituitary gland no longer has important hormones involved in this action, the concentrations of estrogen and progesterone start to taper off. So imagine, these were the hormones that thickened the uterine lining, kept it thick, made sure it was well vascularized, fluids coming in and so on. And all of a sudden, these hormones are withdrawn. No more hormones that are keeping the uterine lining thick. So then After day 28, we restart the cycle at day 0, the menstrual flow. In other words, in response to the withdrawal of estrogen, which was maintaining the thickness of the uterine lining sloughs off. It just falls off. And because of that, there is the bleeding of the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle. So it's in response to estrogen withdrawal. So you've graduated from medical school and you've decided that you want to become an obstetrician or a pediatrician. You followed a couple through a pregnancy. They deliver a beautiful baby girl and they go home the same day. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they call you frantically, and of course you answer the phone because you're available to your patients because you're just like that, and they call you frantically saying that their baby that they just brought home is bleeding from her vagina. Well, what would you say? Would you call an ambulance or would you just comfort them? You may want to pause and consider your response. Well, after reviewing the menstrual cycle, you could imagine that in pregnancy, because the uterus will go from something that's about this size to something that is about that size, the uterus is clearly responding to massive quantities of estrogen and progesterone. And we know that estrogen and progesterone, being steroid hormones, they tend to be able to cross barriers. For example, the barrier between the mother and the infant is the placenta. The placenta produces nutrients, it can store material, and in fact the placenta even produces estrogen and progesterone. So all these hormones from the mother and from the placenta, some of this is being exposed to the infant. So here's the infant, female, with the uterine lining that is becoming thick in response to all this estrogen exposure. Then the baby is born. The baby doesn't have high levels of FSH or LH, of course not, because the baby's not going to have menstrual cycles for years, on average not until year 12. So here's the baby, after having all this estrogen exposure, now she has estrogen withdrawal. And in response to withdrawal, the inner lining or endometrium will slough off or fall off, and therefore menstrual blood flow in response to being born. And so you would be able to comfort the parents and say this is very common. And the only reason that sometimes it doesn't occur is sometimes the flow is very low, or sometimes there is a barrier for the flow to come from the vagina, like the tissue which is called the hymen, and sometimes it might be completely serving as a barrier, and then the body will slowly resorb the blood that is in the vagina. You are only allowed one guess as to which organ this represents. Clearly it's the heart. We're talking about the circulatory system now, and the heart is a muscular organ. It is about the size of your fist. The heart is divided into left and right sides by a septum that runs down pretty much the center of the heart. So that's the septum, which divides the left and right sides of the heart. Now, when we talk about left and right sides, it's always the patient's point of view. For example, it is when you are looking at me, your left is over here, your right is over here. However, you have to consider what is the side for the patient. That's what is always being discussed. So therefore, this is the left side of the patient who is looking at you, and this is the right side of the patient. So this is the left side of the heart, right side of the heart. Now, there are actually 4 chambers in the heart. So it is again subdivided, and there are the upper parts of the heart, which are called the atria, which means there is an atrium on the right side and an atrium on the left side. The bottom parts are called the ventricles. So there is a right ventricle and there is a left ventricle. So let's see what happens to blood as it leaves the heart and leaving, let's say, from the left ventricle. So blood leaving the heart from the left ventricle. To begin with, blood always leaves the heart in arteries. Some students like to remember away starts with A, away in arteries. So it's always like that. And so blood will be returning in the veins. So going away from the heart, from the left ventricle, will be the largest artery in the body, which is called the aorta. So we leave the body from the left ventricle in the aorta. So the aorta will subdivide into smaller arteries. And those smaller arteries will again subdivide into even smaller arteries called arterioles. These smaller arteries or arterioles will then subdivide further into capillary beds. Now, capillaries are tiny, very thin-walled vessels. You have to imagine your entire body has to have some sort of exposure to blood in order to have some diffusion of carbon dioxide, the waste product, which we've seen already, coming from the Krebs cycle and aerobic respiration. And so you need to get rid of that, and also there's exchange of water, there's a need for oxygen and glucose, etc. So you have to have some area in which there's a diffusion taking place. That occurs at the level of these capillary beds, which are a rich network of vessels. They're at the tip of your finger, they're in your heart, they're in your left knee, they're all over your body in order to deliver this exchange of materials. So this is occurring at the level of the capillary network. So this is all oxygenated blood in arteries. And then we have this exchange going on. The blood is now losing oxygen. It's picking up carbon dioxide, one of the waste products. And so we've gone from artery, huge artery, to many arteries, to many, many more arterioles, to this massive network, which is the capillary network or capillary beds. Now we start getting into deoxygenated blood. So this blood is now deoxygenated, which I'll symbolize as blue. It's not really blue. When you look at your arm and you see a vein, it might look blue to you, but it's actually an optical illusion because of the shape of the vessel and light, etc. Because if you actually were to cut it, and I'm not suggesting that experiment whatsoever, but as surgeons we see it all the time, and it's clearly not blue. So here's the deoxygenated blood, which we're only symbolizing being blue. So when it comes out of the capillary network, it now goes into tiny, tiny, tiny veins, which are venules. And then from these tiny veins, it goes into larger veins, and then eventually goes into one of the two largest veins in the body, which are called the venae cava. These venae cava will bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. There's two venae cava. There's one for the inferior or lower part of the body, which is called the inferior vena cava, and there's a part for the upper part of the body, which is called the superior vena cava. These both bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. When the blood gets into the right atrium, it is pumped into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is pumped into the lungs. So it's going away from the lungs away from the heart, and because it's moving away from the heart, it's moving in this direction. Away from the heart means that it's in an artery. So it's going away to the lungs. The word pulmonary refers to the lungs, so it's going away in pulmonary arteries. So it'll go away in the pulmonary arteries. Then it'll go into pulmonary arterioles. Then it'll go into these capillary beds in the lung. And there it will have an exchange of gases in the small parts of the lung where the alveoli are, and that's where there will be an exchange of gases where it will release carbon dioxide, our waste product of cellular metabolism, which we blow off in the lungs, and then we bring in oxygen, and that oxygen is going to be exchanged at the level of the capillary beds in the lung. Now notice, this blood coming from the right ventricle was deoxygenated. It lost oxygen in the capillary beds in the body system. So you cannot say that all arteries carry oxygenated blood. It would not be true. Blood going into the body system, that is oxygenated in an artery. But blood going to the pulmonary system is deoxygenated in pulmonary arteries. So just because it's an artery doesn't tell you if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. It depends on where that artery is going to. So in the lung, in the capillary beds, we get oxygenation in the lung. So then we have those capillary beds now becoming oxygenated, then going to venules and veins and returning to the left side of the heart in pulmonary veins. So coming to the left side of the heart in the pulmonary veins. And then coming to the left atrium, it's oxygenated blood, and then the left atrium will pump into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle will again pump into the body system. So notice a few things. First of all, it's as if there are two pumps here. There's a pump that goes to the pulmonary system, and there's a pump that moves towards the body system. So that's why it is sometimes considered that we have two hearts, because there are two pumps that are acting in parallel. The second thing is, because there are two pumps acting in parallel, there are two systems of circulation. There's circulation in the lung, which is called the pulmonary circulation. And there's circulation in the body system, which means to your knee, your leg, your left elbow, all the different parts of your body, your brain, and so on. And that's called systemic circulation. So there's pulmonary circulation, and then there's systemic circulation. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when you're going from the atrium to the ventricle, there are valves. And these valves are very important. On the right side of the heart, there are valves that have three cusps, three sort of leaflets, 1, 2, and a third one. So it's called a tricuspid valve. On the left side of the heart, there's a valve that has two of these cusps, and therefore it's called bicuspid. It is also called the mitral valve. That is the valve on the left side of the heart. That's between the atrium and the ventricle. Now you have to imagine these valves. They have cusps. So they're sort of shaped like this. And if you could imagine that my head is inside of the atrium and blood is coming downwards, what we would see, just imagine me blowing from above. If I were to blow, I'd go, and then it would open up and allow fluid to move from the atrium into the ventricle. Now, when the ventricle were to contract, just because of the shape of these valves, when the ventricle would contract and fluid would be coming from the ventricle, boom, the valve would close, preventing blood from going back into the atrium. So therefore, these are one-way valves. Blood can flow from the atrium into the ventricle, like so. But when the ventricle contracts, then because of the shape, the valve would close back, forcing blood not back into the atrium, but forcing blood into the pulmonary circulation. And when blood comes into the left atrium, pushed into the ventricle, when the ventricle contracts, then blood will go into the aorta and not back into the atrium. In fact, if there was a problem with one of the valves in your heart, then you would hear a heart murmur, which is an abnormal sound between the normal heart sounds. Now, the arteries in the body all have muscular walls. And so, because of these muscular walls, they can be affected to maintain a certain blood pressure. And we can calculate this blood pressure or hydrostatic pressure. And it is such that when the ventricles contract, you're going to have the highest blood pressure. And then when the ventricles relax, you have the lower blood pressure. The largest, most muscular chamber in the heart is the left ventricle. And the reason for this is that it must pump blood to the whole body system, except, of course, to most of the areas of the lung. It doesn't have to send blood to most of the areas of the lung because that happens in pulmonary circulation. But it does have to send blood to the entire blood system, body system, and therefore it has to be very large and it contracts. So when it does contract, we can calculate the blood pressure, and average blood pressure for humans is 120/80. It's measured in millimeters of mercury. The 120 represents the blood pressure when the ventricle contracts, and that is called the systolic blood pressure. The 80 represents the blood pressure in millimeters of mercury when the ventricle relaxes, and that is called the diastolic blood pressure. Clearly, the fluid that circulates in the circulatory system is blood. Blood has two main components, plasma and formed elements. Plasma represents about 55% of blood, formed elements 45%. Plasma is essentially water with some very important proteins. There are three main categories. One is albumin. Albumin is a protein that can carry other molecules in the blood system, or albumin also serves to maintain osmotic pressure in the blood vessels. There's also fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a molecule which is converted into fibrin when necessary. And fibrin is a very important component of blood clots. And thirdly, there is a group of proteins called the globulins. And the most important part of this group of proteins are antibodies. And we'll be discussing antibodies a little bit later. So that's plasma. Then there are the formed elements. The formed elements, representing 45% of blood volume, includes red blood cells. Now, red blood cells is 99% of the formed elements, so it's almost all red blood cells. And of course, we know that red blood cells are extremely important in terms of the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, red blood cells are biconcave cells, and they contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a molecule that has two parts, the heme and the globin part. The heme has iron in it. Globin is a protein. So hemoglobin is very important in the red blood cell. As the red blood cells pass through the circulatory system, go into those capillaries in pulmonary circulation, and that is where diffusion takes place. The red blood cells release the carbon dioxide and take in oxygen. Oxygen binds to the hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cell and becomes this sort of bright red. And so it is oxyhemoglobin which is responsible for that bright red color. And then it goes through the system and then into the capillaries and systemic circulation where oxygen is given off to the cells and carbon dioxide is taken up. Carbon dioxide bonds to the hemoglobin molecule and creates carbaminohemoglobin, which is darker. Not blue, but it is darker than the bright red color. In muscle cells, the bright red color is from another molecule, which is very similar to hemoglobin, but it is called myoglobin. And words that have myo in it often refer to muscle. So those are the red blood cells. Then there are platelets. Platelets are cytoplasmic fragments from bigger cells. And these fragments are very important, again, like fibrin, in terms of creating blood clots. Then there are the white blood cells. And white blood cells are critical for fighting off infection. There are two main categories of white blood cells. There are the granulocytes and agranulocytes. Now, whenever you hear the word cyte, just like in cytoplasm, which means plasm in the cell, or cytosol, which is solution in the cell, cyto refers to cell. So a granulocyte is a cell that has granules, and granules are just packets of stuff. And so if you were to look at a granulocyte under a microscope, you just see all these packets of stuff. You look at an agranulocyte, those same packets aren't there, but you have all the other organelles, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, nuclei, stuff like that. So in the granulocytes, there are three types of cells. They are the neutrophils, the basophils, and the eosinophils. The neutrophils are the dominant component of pus. So clearly a very important part of the body's reaction to infection. Then there are agranulocytes, and the agranulocytes are mostly divided into lymphocytes and monocytes. Lymphocytes are a type of cell that we're going to discuss in greater detail when we look at the immune system and the lymphatic system. But the lymphocytes are indeed part of blood. Monocytes are cells that have various names. They are indeed white blood cells. They are also called macrophages, and they are called this when they're outside of the circulatory system. They may be called a macrophage or a phagocyte. Now, a phagocyte is a cell, just like phagocytosis, it's a cell that eats other cells. Phagocytosis literally means cell eating. So a monocyte is in the circulatory system, and it is a cell that can eat other cells, specifically bacteria and cells that are causing infection. Of course, it can also attack viruses, but we know that viruses are not really cells. We will now look at the immune system, but first we will discuss lymph, because lymph is intimately associated with the immune system. Just like blood is the fluid that circulates in the cardiovascular system, which we often call the circulatory system, lymph is the fluid that circulates in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system has a bunch of vessels in the body, and these vessels, or that contain lymph, is concerned with the third space in your body. You see, there are three places where fluid can be in your body: intracellular, which we've seen; intravascular, which we've also seen; or fluid could be in neither the intracellular or intravascular space. That's called the third space. It's also called the extracellular space. It is also called the interstitial space. So lymph will bathe these cells. Lymph contains clearly lots of water, some nutrients, and some lymphocytes, so cells that circulate in the lymphatic tissue. These lymphocytes are divided into both T cells and B cells. Now, in the lymphatic system, you have different elements. For example, you have lymph nodes. And lymph nodes will have a high concentration of these white blood cells, which will help to fight off infection. Lymph nodes are sort of pea-sized, and you can feel them or palpate them. You can often feel them in your neck or sort of under your chin. You can also feel them in the groin. and you'll feel these pea-sized shaped organs, and these are your lymph nodes that are hooked up to your lymphatic system. So you have these little lymphatic capillaries all around your body going up to larger lymphatic vessels that usually draw lymph to the lymph nodes so that infection and so on can be taken care of. And then eventually this lymphatic fluid will return to the cardiovascular system. There are other parts of the lymphatic system, including the spleen. And the spleen is an organ that is found on the left side under the ribs. And this organ sort of has two parts to it, a white pulp and a red pulp. The red pulp is not part of the immune system, it's red, and it sort of stores blood, red blood cells. The spleen is sometimes called a blood-storing organ. The white part is part of the immune system, and this white pulp kind of filters infection and fights off infection, and so it's a very important part of the immune system. So that's the spleen. And then there is the thymus gland, which is in the upper part of the chest, and the thymus helps to mature T cells. The T from thymus, T cells. In fact, the thymus secretes another hormone, believe it or not, called thymosin, and thymosin is felt to stimulate T cells. Now, T cells and B cells both originate in the bone marrow. So you can think of the B being in B cells being for bone marrow, even though it actually stands for bursa in birds, but that has nothing to do with the MCAT. But the B cell, you can think it meaning coming from the bone marrow. T cells also come from the bone marrow, but they're matured in the thymus gland, so they're called T cells. Now, T cells are an important element of what is called cellular immunity. Cellular immunity is a type of non-specific immunity in which the T cells will attack the infection. So whatever infection that is going on, there's bacteria that's in your body or there's a virus in your body, then for sure you're going to have neutrophils, which are on the scene very early. You have monocytes or macrophages or these phagocytes, which are attacking this bacteria and virus. You'll also have T cells, which will go on the attack, and so they phagocytize. They will eat that bacteria, bring it into the cell, and the lysosomes will fuse with it and break it apart, and the body will use the parts for other purposes. So this is all part of the attack against infection using the T cells. But there are other types of T cells. Some cells are called T4 cells or T helper cells. These T helper cells will stimulate other cells to help in the attack. So it will stimulate other T cells. It'll also stimulate B cells. It'll also stimulate macrophages and other types of cells. So these T helper cells are very important. Unfortunately, T helper cells are specifically targeted by the HIV virus, and that leads to severe immunodeficiency. Nonetheless, T cells can activate, with the T helper cell, the B cells to produce these new type of cells called plasma cells. You see, B cells are cells that are involved not in cell-mediated immunity like T cells, where a cell attacks directly. B cells are involved in humoral immunity, which is very specific to the type of infection. It's not just that a cell will arrive and just eat any problem that is in front of it. That's non-specific. T cells. B cells is very specific, and the way it is so specific is incredibly fascinating. What will happen with the B cell is that a macrophage will go find the infection, attack, phagocytize, bring in the bacteria or virus. Then it will take a part of the membrane or the outer part of the virus and it will bring it to its surface of the macrophage. And the macrophage will call the B cell over by sending chemicals up. It will call the B cell over and it'll say, look, don't attack me because I'm one of the white blood cells, just like you are. But listen, I've just removed part of something which is attacking our body. I want you to look at this, and I want you to create a weapon specifically targeting this part of that bacteria or virus. So that part of the bacteria or virus is called an antigen. Now the B cell will create something to specifically attack that antigen. So it's actually going to make a brand new protein, a protein that's never been seen in your body before. And it will create that protein to specifically attack that antigen. The protein that the B cell will create would be called an antibody. And this antibody is also sometimes called immunoglobulin. This antibody, designed specifically to attack part of the membrane or outer part of the virus or bacteria or fungus or whatever else is attacking the body, will be able to destroy that cell in a very specific way, many different types of fashions. For example, it can destroy the cell just by the fact that the antibody hits that specific part. That cell might be destroyed by lysis or explosion. That happens. Not too often, but that could happen. But sometimes it will attack those cells and clump them together. That's called agglutination. Sometimes it will attack the cell and make the cell much more desirable for other white blood cells to attack, like T cells, macrophages, neutrophils. That idea that you're attacking a cell and making it much more desirable for other cells to attack, that's called opsonization. So there's many different ways in which B cells, by creating antibodies, can specifically destroy cells. So that's called the humoral response, which is a specific response to infection because the B cell actually constructed an antibody aimed for a specific type of antigen. When the B cells start to multiply, they will create some memory cells, so that if ever you get that infection again, there's some cells that already have the antibody ready to solve the problem, so that you don't have to start from scratch where the B cell's spending time trying to design a protein to attack the antigen. Rather, you've got some memory cells ready, so your secondary response, the second time you're exposed to it, will be much faster than the first time you were exposed to the infection, your primary response. The B cell will also create lots of plasma cells. Plasma cells are B cells that are just dividing and dividing because they're sending off antibodies. They're producing much as possible these weapons to attack the antigen. So these are called plasma cells that are rapidly dividing, and the T helper cells help the B cells in order to rapidly divide and make more plasma cells. And this will attack, again, the source of infection. You are looking at a very diagrammatic view of the digestive system. This is the person's head, mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and colon. The digestive system is also called the gastrointestinal system, or the GI tract. It is also called the alimentary canal. The digestive system begins in the mouth. So you take a chocolate bar or something, you put it in your mouth, that's called ingestion. Then you start chewing on it, that's fragmentation, helped of course by your teeth. And then you have some things that are being secreted into your mouth. There's saliva and there's mucus. The mucus helps to roll up the food into a bolus. The saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is the first level of digestion because digestion specifically refers to chemical breakdown. So salivary amylase is an enzyme that's secreted in the mouth by the saliva, and it helps to break down carbohydrates into their subunits. So that's the beginning of digestion. Then this food particle is a bolus, it's called a bolus, and it is placed at the back of the mouth as the tongue rolls it towards the back, into the pharynx, and down the esophagus. Now, in order for the food to actually go down the esophagus and not to go down the windpipe, which is actually the trachea, because we don't want it going into the lung, we want it going into the gastrointestinal tract, there's a little flap of tissue called the epiglottis, which will cover the glottis. The epiglottis is around the glottis. So it covers the glottis, preventing food from going down into the respiratory tract and making sure that it continues along the alimentary tract. Now we have food in the esophagus. Now the food in the esophagus will go down into the stomach, well, in part because of gravity, but not necessarily just gravity, because could you imagine peanut butter would always get stuck if it just was relying on gravity. So the alimentary tract also has another thing that helps to move things along, and that's peristalsis. Peristalsis is a concentric movement of muscle in which it is squeezed and pushes things along the alimentary tract. That occurs anywhere along the GI tract where you can have some peristalsis, not just in the esophagus, but you also have it in the small bowel and the colon to move contents through the GI tract. So then we have the contents move through the GI, through the upper part of the GI tract, the esophagus, into the stomach. Now, in the stomach, we have a lot of churning motions that occur in the stomach. We also have in the stomach a very low pH. In other words, the concentration of hydrogen ion in the stomach is very high. The pH is about 2. The pH in the stomach is low for several reasons. To begin with, the first thing is that by having a low pH in the stomach, that helps to hydrolyze food, means to break it apart. Second reason is that there is an enzyme in the stomach called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is converted into pepsin in a low pH environment. So when pepsinogen is turned into pepsin, pepsin can break down proteins. So in other words, this is another level of digestion in the digestive tract. Pepsin in the stomach breaking down proteins into their subunits, which we know, of course, are amino acids. So that's the second reason. The third reason that the pH is low in the stomach is to destroy bacteria. Could you imagine? Dogs must have a very low pH in their stomach because you know dogs' tongues have been in many different places. So you can imagine that the pH of the stomach is low so that if there are bacteria or other things that shouldn't be in the body that happen to get into the stomach, these things can be destroyed in the environment of a very low pH. So this is what occurs in the stomach. This churning and so on that occurs in the stomach produces this fluid called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So chyme is produced in the stomach, and then this muscular stomach squirts the chyme into the small intestine. The small intestine is divided into 3 parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, and it is in that order. The small intestine is very long, and in fact the entire GI tract from stem to stern is about 30 feet long, or about 9 meters long. The small intestine has a lot of surface area, and it increases its surface area in order to absorb all the products like amino acids and break down products of carbohydrates and so on. And it increases its surface area with villi and microvilli. Villi are undulations or finger-like projections of groups of cells. So in order to increase the surface area, microvilli are finger-like projections of single cells. So that increases the surface area of individual cells. And we know that microvilli have microtubules as a core, just like flagella. Now, we've already looked at the endocrine system, and we said that that was the bunch of glands and tissues, cells, organs, which secrete their products into body fluids. For example, hormones into the bloodstream. So it goes around in the body and then it affects certain organs. However, if there is a gland or tissue that secretes its products to the outside of the body, rather than being called endocrine, it's called exocrine because the product exits the body, so it's an exocrine organ. For example, in the skin, there are glands that secrete their products onto the skin in order to make the skin supple or smooth or oily or whatever. And these products are called exocrine glands. Likewise, there are products that secrete into the GI tract. These products are called exocrine products, and the glands are exocrine glands. It is considered so because the GI tract is exposed to the outside and it releases product to the outside as well. So it's called exocrine organs. There are two important exocrine organs for the GI tract is the pancreas and the liver. We've already seen the endocrine part of the pancreas in that it secretes insulin and glucagon, and these are important hormones. But the pancreas also secretes pancreatic juice, and this pancreatic juice contains many different important enzymes, which are exocrine products, which are secreted into the duodenum via a special duct called the common bile duct. And this pancreatic juice contains many enzymes such as nucleases, which break down nucleic acids into their subunits. And it also secretes things called pancreatic amylase, does the same thing as salivary amylase, breaks down carbohydrates into subunits. It also secretes lipase, which breaks down fats. And it secretes many different enzymes that breaks down proteins in specific ways, like trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase. So these are all products secreted by the pancreas in response to the fact that you ate a chocolate bar. And so what happens is that there are some enzymes like secretin and CCK, which these are hormones secreted by the duodenum, which will go to the pancreas and say, time for pancreatic juice because here comes some chyme from the stomach. Pancreatic juice is also high in bicarbonate. And the reason is that if the fluid from the stomach just was squirted into the duodenum with that low pH in the stomach, a pH of 2, and if that was happening all day long, then everybody's going to start developing ulcers because the acid will start eating away at the duodenum. So the pancreas secretes bicarbonate, and bicarbonate will react with the acid and help to neutralize the acid. So that all is part of the pancreatic juice. There's also the liver. The liver will produce bile from liver cells. Liver cells are called hepatocytes. So the liver will produce bile. Bile is stored and concentrated in the gallbladder. The gallbladder will then squirt the bile down the ducts, eventually the common bile duct, just like pancreatic juice. This enters the duodenum. Now bile emulsifies fat, which means it increases the surface area of the fat so that the enzymes that came from the pancreas, like lipase, can start to break down the fat into its subunits. So we have enzymes breaking down into subunits. We have bile emulsifying the fat. Bile also helps in the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. Those are the fat-soluble vitamins: vitamin A, vitamin D, E, and K. Some students just remember ADEK are the 4 fat-soluble vitamins. So when all this is occurring and this activity is occurring and you're digesting these particular molecules, then the small bowel will start to absorb them. So it absorbs the amino acids, it absorbs the nucleic acids, and so on. Then, and the way that it will absorb it is because there are networks of capillaries around the small bowel which will absorb these nutrients and send them along a special vein called a portal vein, along the special portal vein to the liver. So if it has to do with the liver, it's called hepatic, like a hepatocyte is a liver cell. So this special vein going to the liver is called the hepatic portal vein. So it goes to the liver and then to another series of capillaries so that the liver can process these nutrients, can detoxify anything that might be toxic to the body and process glucose and turn it into glycogen, and other such things can be done by the liver. Fats have a different route. Fats do not go to the liver for processing. Rather, fats will go into the lymphatic system and eventually get into the cardiovascular system, as we discussed earlier, that the lymphatic system does bring products into the cardiovascular system. In order to get into the lymphatic system, fats are absorbed by the capillaries of the lymphatic system. The capillaries of the lymphatic system are called lacteals. So now we have all these nutrients that the body is absorbing because of the great surface area of the small bowel, because it has digested the macromolecules into smaller components, and therefore it's being taken in by the body. And then the fluid continues along the small bowel and then goes into the colon, which is the large intestine. Now, the small bowel or small intestine is called small because its diameter is small, but it's the longest part of the alimentary canal. The colon is called the large intestine because it has the widest portion in the alimentary canal. The colon is divided into different segments. It begins with the cecum, which has a small thing attached to it called the appendix. And then we have the right colon or ascending colon, the colon that goes across the body, which is the transverse colon, then down the left side, the left colon or descending colon. Then there's a part of the colon that curves, which is called the sigmoid colon. It ends in the rectum, and then there's the anus. Now, the purpose of the colon is essentially to absorb water, and it's important in terms of electrolyte balance. There is little or no digestion that occurs in the colon, and that is the production of feces, the color of which is produced mostly from breakdown products of red blood cells. And there is a lot of bacteria that is contained in feces.